Complaints about the smell from the corner house on Imperial Avenue began as early as 2007. Neighbors called the police, contacted the health department, and filed reports. But each time they received the same answer. There is a sausage factory, Ray's Sausage, nearby, and the smell is coming from there. This version became so convenient that everyone repeated it, including the owner of the house himself. Sickening, sweetish, and soaking into clothes and hair. This smell haunted the residents of the street for almost 2 years, and it never occurred to anyone to check the house itself. Cleveland, Ohio, the eastern part of the city. The neighborhood was not prosperous, but the people here knew each other. Anthony Sowell, the 50-year-old owner of that very corner house, was considered a quiet neighbor. Sometimes he would set up a grill in the yard, greet passers-by, and generally avoid drawing attention to himself. A Marine Corps veteran on a small disability pension, he led a secluded lifestyle. It was this image that allowed him to remain unnoticed for years. And it was this man who lived calmly in the house from which that very smell wafted down the entire street. By 2008, the complaints had become regular. Neighbors described not only the smell, but also the strange noises at night, screams, thuds, and various sounds of struggling. Police responded to calls, but each time it ended the same way. A perimeter check, no visible violations, and the case was closed. The area was considered problematic. Residents often complained about noise, and police resources were limited. The system worked by inertia, and no one questioned why the smell didn't go away even after the factory conducted its own inspections and spent thousands of dollars cleaning its ventilation. Sowell himself behaved extremely calmly during all of this. When asked about the smell, he answered the same thing as everyone else: the factory. He didn't just repeat someone else's version, he actively supported it, shifting any suspicion to an external source. And here is what's interesting. The man living in the very epicenter of this stench never once complained himself. It was as if the smell didn't bother him at all. But at the time, no one paid attention to this. This continued until the fall of 2009. On September 22nd, a woman walked into a Cleveland police station. Latundra Billups. She had marks on her face, characteristic imprints on her neck, and was in a state of extreme shock. She could barely speak, but she insisted on being heard immediately. According to her, she had met a man on the street. He invited her to his place for a beer, and once inside the house, everything changed instantly. An attack, strangulation with an electric cable, and only by chance did she manage to break free. She described the address exactly: the corner building on Imperial Avenue, the very same house from which the smell had been emanating for years. It was then that investigators finally decided to check what they should have checked 2 years ago. More than a month passed between Billups' statement and the raid on the house. Bureaucracy, approvals, the processing queue. All this time, Sowell remained at home, knowing that Latundra had survived and gone to the police. But he did not try to flee or destroy evidence. It was as if he was certain the system would fail to notice him once again. A database check yielded results almost immediately. He had a prior conviction for a similar crime, 15 years in prison, released in 2005, and was registered as a high-risk offender. At this point, the investigator lingered on the case longer than usual. He pulled up the complete archive of complaints for that address, and the result surprised even the experienced officer. dozens of complaints over the last 2 years. Neighbors regularly reported a sickening smell, screams at night, and suspicious activity near the house. Every time the call was closed the same way, the source was identified as the nearby sausage factory. Not once was an inspection of the house itself conducted. Furthermore, according to regulations, registered offenders are subject to regular home visits. The investigator requested the patrol reports. On paper, everything looked flawless. Visits were recorded, signatures were in place, and no violations were noted. However, not a single report mentioned the smell. That same smell the street's residents had been complaining about for years. On October 29, 2009, a team of 6 officers headed to Imperial Avenue. Multiple cars, full gear, and a warrant for arrest and search. Neighbors saw the column and realized something serious was happening. When the officers approached the house, they smelled it immediately, even before they opened the door. Thick, sweetish, and penetrating even through their protective masks. One of the officers took a step back. In their years of service, they had encountered many things, but no one had ever met such a concentration. A loud knock on the door. The voice of the team leader. Cleveland Police, search warrant. Silence. No footsteps, no voice. Not the slightest movement from inside. A second knock. Again, nothing. According to protocol, the wait is 30 seconds, and those seconds dragged on agonizingly long. The commander gave the signal for a forced entry. The ram hit the lock, and the door flew off its hinges with a first blow. What poured out from inside made the first line recoil. Not just the smell, though it became several times stronger. The sound, a low, continuous hum, flies. Thousands of insects swirled in the air, covered the walls, and crawled across the ceiling. No one in the group had seen such a quantity before, and everyone in the group understood that flies appear in such numbers only under certain conditions. The team entered and began checking the first floor. Room by room, corner by corner, the same picture everywhere. Trash on the floor, broken furniture, sticky stains of unknown origin. But with each floor, the smell intensified. The buzzing of the flies grew louder, and everyone already understood that something terrible awaited them behind these walls. The third floor met them with the same chaos, but here the picture was even stranger. Empty beer cans were everywhere. On the floor, on windowsills, stacked in pyramids in the corners. Dirty clothes lay in heaps, mixed with trash and food scraps. And then, in one of the rooms, women's belongings were discovered. Handbags, jewelry, items of clothing of different sizes and styles. Too many for one person, too varied to belong to one woman. A database check showed that Sowell had no wife, sister, or daughter. No female relatives visited the address. Among the personal items, they found a stack of women's IDs. 7 documents. Different names, different faces, different dates of birth. Some of these women were listed as missing. Relatives were looking for them, and their cases lay in the archives of unsolved disappearances. And their documents were kept in Anthony Sowell's desk drawer. It was then that one of the officers noticed something in the corner of the room. At first, it was taken for a pile of rags, but upon closer inspection, it became clear that these were human remains. Another set was discovered nearby. 2 bodies on the 3rd floor, both in extremely poor condition. The officer immediately called for reinforcements. The house was cordoned off, and a massive search of all premises began. But, as it would later turn out, the finds on the 3rd floor were only the beginning. Another group went down to the basement. Standard procedure: check all rooms without exception. The basement in this house was unusual, with a dirt floor and a low ceiling. A flashlight beam swept across the surface and stopped. Part of the ground looked completely different. Freshly dug, loose, and differing in color from the rest of the floor. It was at that moment the officers realized the scale of what was happening went far beyond an ordinary investigation. The decision to excavate was made within the hour. An additional crew with equipment was called in. Working in the cramped space of the basement required maximum caution. Each layer of soil was removed carefully, sifting the contents through a screen. At a depth of 1/2 meter, the first results appeared. Fragments of cloth, then human remains. The third find in one day. Nearby, signs of other burials were found. The earth in several places had the same structure: loose, recently disturbed. Teams with ground-penetrating radar were sent to the basement to scan the entire floor area. The results showed multiple anomalies beneath the surface. By the evening of the same day, the team had recovered 4 more bodies from the basement. Work continued under artificial lighting deep into the night. Then they checked the backyard, and remains were found there as well. Residents of the street gathered behind the police tape, watching the flow of forensic vehicles. Rumors spread faster than official information. But even the neighbors' darkest assumptions did not come close to the real scale of what this house held. The neighbors couldn't imagine that in the building they walked past every day, people had been disappearing for years. And that smell they had complained about for 2 years didn't come from the factory. Anthony Sowell was not at home that day. Evidence suggested he had left very recently. A cup of half-drunk coffee stood in the kitchen. Fresh cigarette butts lay in the ashtray, and the television was turned off, but still warm to the touch. The commander immediately contacted dispatch and launched a manhunt. All neighborhood patrols received his description, and the search expanded throughout East Cleveland. Patrol cars combed the streets, while foot patrols checked shops and bus stops. The neighborhood knew his face, and hiding there was practically impossible. On October 31st, Halloween, all of Cleveland followed the news from the house on Imperial Avenue. Sowell had remained at large for 3 days. Then a call came in. A patrolman spotted a man a few blocks from the cordoned-off zone. A calm gait, hands in pockets, no rush. The officer called for backup and approached. And here is what was strange. Sowell did not run or resist. He simply stopped and held out his hands for handcuffs. The man in whose house several bodies had been found did not try to hide. It was as if he was certain the system would let him go again. But this time, he was wrong. To understand how such a thing became possible at all, one must go back many years. Anthony Sowell was born in Cleveland and grew up in a disadvantaged area of the city's east side. After school, he enlisted in the Marine Corps and served for 7 years. His military records were positive, disciplined, dutiful, and had no conflicts with command. On paper, it looked like the story of a man who managed to escape a difficult environment. But after his discharge, his biography changed trajectory sharply. In 1989, Sowell was arrested for attacking a woman. He dragged her into his home, tied her up, and held her for 3 days. The victim survived only because she managed to escape while he was sleeping. The court sentenced him to 15 years in prison. And here is what is important to understand. Even then, his pattern of action was exactly the same. The same methods of binding, the same marks on the victim's neck, the same scenario. But back then, the woman managed to survive and testify. In 2005, Sowell was released and moved into his stepmother's house on Imperial Avenue. According to Ohio law, he was required to register as a high-risk offender. Registration implied checks and restrictions on living near schools. In practice, the visits from the probation officer were a formality. Home inspections boiled down to a conversation at the doorstep. Resources were scarce. The area was considered problematic, and Sowell was just one of hundreds in the database. 15 years of imprisonment had not rehabilitated him. They had hardened him. In prison, he learned to hide his impulses and mask himself as an ordinary person. And now, 4 years after his release, the investigation was beginning to understand what he had been doing all that time. He was brought to Cleveland's Central Station within an hour. A crowd demanding justice gathered outside the police building. Inside, preparations were made for the interrogation. Sowell was placed in a standard room, a table, 2 chairs, and a camera in the corner. And what immediately struck the investigator was that he sat calmly, without the slightest sign of agitation or fear. In 40 years of practice, the investigator had seen hundreds of suspects, but he had never encountered such cold composure. The first hours of interrogation yielded no results. Sowell denied everything. He didn't know these women, didn't understand what was being talked about, and demanded a lawyer. The investigator changed approaches, showed photographs, and read witness statements. The reaction remained zero. Then Sowell simply stopped answering questions. He sat, stared at the wall, and remained silent for hours. This was the sign of a man who knew his guilt exactly and was calculating his options. The turning point came on the second day. The investigator changed strategy. Instead of accusations, he began talking about pressure, about illness, and how society hadn't given him a chance after his release. Sowell listened, and then, for the first time in many hours, he spoke. But it was not a confession. It was a game. Phrases like, "I don't remember," "maybe," "possibly," "something happened." Evasive formulations without specifics. He admitted to the facts in general terms, but refused to provide details, controlling every word and rationing information. And then, a key moment of the interrogation occurred, one that would later be replayed dozens of times. The investigator asked him directly if he understood what he had done. Sowell looked him in the eye and said, "I'm not a monster. I'm just sick." No remorse in his voice, no emotion on his face. Just a statement of fact, as if he were describing the weather outside. He did not consider himself a criminal. He considered himself a victim of circumstances and his own psyche. Meanwhile, the search operations in the house continued for more than a week. Forensic experts checked every square meter: floors, walls, the basement, and the backyard. Ground-penetrating radar showed anomalies in all areas, and finds could be anywhere. By the beginning of November, the work officially concluded. The final tally: 11 bodies. 11 women whose lives ended within those walls. In the basement, they also discovered a bucket containing a human skull, the origin of which had to be established separately. The identification procedure began. The condition of most of the remains did not allow for visual identification, so experts used DNA analysis and dental record comparisons. Samples were sent to labs, and results returned gradually. The first names appeared after a few days. Each name meant someone's daughter, sister, or mother. Each name closed a missing persons case that had been gathering dust in the archives for years. The system had been looking for these women, but it had been looking in the wrong place. They were all local residents from disadvantaged neighborhoods. Many had issues with addiction, and some were in vulnerable positions. Their disappearances did not cause a wide public outcry. They had become invisible long before they physically vanished. After the list of victims was published, new reports began coming into the police. It turned out that Latundra Billups was not the only survivor. At least 4 women had been attacked by Sowell, but managed to escape or were let go. Some of them had contacted the police before, but their testimony was not taken seriously. Fear, distrust of the system, shame? Now, when the scale of what was happening became obvious, they decided to speak. The survivors' testimony completed the picture, and the pattern of actions repeated with frightening precision. Meeting on the street, an invitation home, an offer of a drink. Sowell sought out women in certain parts of the neighborhood, near stores, at bus stops, near bars. He chose those who were in a vulnerable position. The approach was always friendly. A quiet, middle-aged man from next door. Nothing suspicious. Then once inside, a sudden change in behavior. The survivors described the same moment. Sowell's eyes changed instantly, as if a switch had been flipped inside. The attack followed without warning. A blow, a grab, binding with electrical cables. Everything was prepared in advance. And here is what is especially important to understand. He was never in a hurry. Survivors said that he squeezed their throats until they lost consciousness, then let go and started again. Forensics confirmed this detail. Marks on the remains pointed to multiple episodes of strangulation. For him, the process itself was important, not the result. Sowell took pleasure in absolute power over someone else's life, and control meant more to him than the final outcome. But the darkest side of his psyche was revealed by what happened after. He did not get rid of the remains. He kept them. In the basement, under the floors, in the walls, in the backyard. The house turned into a collection. Psychologists call this trophy behavior. The criminal maintains a connection with what he has done, reliving it over and over again. Sowell lived among these bodies for years. He slept, ate, and watched TV. This became his norm. At the same time, a psychiatric evaluation was underway. From the beginning, the defense insisted on a plea of insanity. Experts conducted a series of tests and lengthy interviews. The result was unequivocal. Sowell was fully aware of his actions at the time they were committed. He understood the difference between right and wrong. He intentionally hid tracks and avoided detection. This was the behavior of a sane person, not an insane one. In December 2009, the court officially recognized him as sane and fit to stand trial. The indictment included 11 counts of aggravated murder. Each count carried the possibility of the death penalty. From that moment, preparations began for a trial that would stretch on for many months. The trial began in July 2011, almost 2 years after the bodies were discovered. The Cuyahoga County courtroom was packed to capacity. The victims' families occupied the front rows. 11 families united by a common tragedy. Cameras broadcast the proceedings to the entire state. Sowell sat at the defense table in a prison uniform, his face motionless. And here is what struck everyone in the room: a complete lack of any emotion. It was as if it wasn't about his fate, but about someone else. The defense insisted on insanity until the very end. Lawyers cited a difficult childhood, psychiatric abnormalities, and the fact that society did not give him a chance after his first prison term. But the prosecution presented a body of evidence that left no room for maneuver. Biological samples, expert results, testimony from survivors, interrogation tapes, more than 300 volumes of case materials. Sowell's DNA was found on every body without exception. His fingerprints were on the victim's personal belongings, on the materials used to hide the remains, and on the tools from the basement. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 8 women and 4 men studied hundreds of pages of evidence, viewed photographs, and listened to expert testimony. The volume of material was unprecedented for that county's court. Finally, on Friday morning, the verdict was announced. The room froze. The foreperson stood up and began to read. Guilty. On the first count, guilty. On the second, and so on, count by count. 81 counts, guilty on every one. Families in the room cried, hugged each other. Some shouted curses at the defendant. Sowell did not move. His face remained as empty as on the first day of the trial. After the verdict, the penalty phase began. The prosecution demanded the death penalty. Witnesses from both sides were invited to the courtroom. Relatives of the victims went to the microphone and spoke about their loss. Mothers spoke about daughters. Sisters remembered their childhood together. Each speech added another piece of a shattered life to the overall picture. The jury retired to deliberate again, but this time the decision came faster. A unanimous recommendation: the death penalty. The judge accepted the recommendation without hesitation and read the sentence in a steady voice. Sowell listened in silence. Not a single muscle twitched in his face. When the final words about the method of execution were spoken, he only blinked. After the sentencing, he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He did not look back at the relatives of his victims and did not say a word. Death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution awaited him. But fate would decide otherwise. In 2021, Sowell would die in prison of unspecified causes, never having lived to see his sentence carried out. Justice, albeit in a different form, finally caught up with him. And the house on Imperial Avenue had remained standing all this time. Empty, boarded up, cordoned off with police tape. Neighbors avoided it, while some came specifically to take photos. For some, it was a place of tragedy. For others, a grim landmark. The city took a long time to decide what to do with the building. It was impossible to sell it, let alone use it. And so, in December 2011, heavy machinery was brought to the house. Excavators, bulldozers, trucks to remove the debris. Residents of the street came out to watch. Some brought flowers, others just stood in silence. The building that had exuded that very smell for years and kept terrible secrets was finally to disappear. The first blow of the bucket hit the roof. Then the walls crumbled, floor after floor. The work took several hours, but no one left. Special attention was paid to the basement. The concrete slabs were crushed, and the earth was excavated to a depth of several meters. Everything was taken to a special landfill. Experts insisted on the complete destruction of the foundation. Nothing was to remain of this place. Not a stone, not a board, not a handful of earth. By the next morning, only a wasteland remained on the site of the house, a level area covered with fresh soil. Residents said the street seemed wider and brighter. the heaviness that had hung over the place for years began to dissipate. In the spring of 2012, a memorial was installed on the empty lot. Simple, without pretense. 11 markers with names, a small area for flowers, a bench for those who want to sit and remember. The families of the victims participated in the design, and for them, this place became a spot where they could come and honor the memory of their loved ones. The memorial quickly became part of the neighborhood. Locals brought flowers and sometimes lit candles in the evenings. And here is what changed after this story. People became more attentive. A strange smell, unusual sounds, suspicious behavior. Now, these were not ignored. But the price of this lesson turned out to be too high. 11 women died because the system closed its eyes to obvious signals time and again. Neighbors complained about the smell for 2 years. The police wrote everything off to a sausage factory. Survivors came forward with reports, but they were not taken seriously. A man with a conviction for a similar crime lived under formal supervision, and no one ever stepped inside his house. This story became one of the most high-profile in Ohio's criminal history, not only because of the number of victims, but because of how long it all went on, literally in plain sight. The house stood on an ordinary street. People walked past it every day, and inside, for years, things happened that would later shock even experienced investigators. And here is the main question that remains after this story. How many more such houses are standing right now while we write off a strange smell to a nearby factory? Write what you think. See you soon.